Welcome to the History Politics Podcast, Putting the Past to Work from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to the History Politics Podcast, Putting the Past to Work. I'm Rose Campbell, Assistant Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. In today's episode, we're going to delve into a topic that is very new to us on this podcast, sorcery. This probably seems like a strange topic to cover in a podcast devoted to the intersection of history and policy, but we're going to take a look at sorcery as it relates to the history of colonialism in the Dominican Republic, as well as Haiti. It is exactly this relationship that Professor Robin Lauren Derby explores in her most recent book, Bête Noire, Sorcery as History in the Haitian-Dominican Borderlands, which was published by Duke University Press in late 2025. Through detailed historical research and ethnographic interviews, Robin argues that because spirits that present as animals and generate wealth for their owners are a manifestation of what Dominicans call the curse of Columbus. The Bacas only manifest as types of animals that Christopher Columbus brought with him: dogs, pigs, cattle, and horses. As we'll talk about throughout this episode, stories about the Baca reveal the cultural memory of authoritarianism and colonialism, as well as the Dominican experience with modern capitalist exploitation and remnants of colonialism. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Derby herself. Robin is Professor of History here at UCLA. Her previous research has explored everyday life under regimes of state terror, the longue durée social history of the Haitian and Dominican border, and has considered how notions of race, national identity, and witchcraft have been articulated in popular media such as rumor, food, and animals. Thank you so much for joining us today, Robin.
Oh, thank you for listening.
So before we get into your book itself, let's talk a little bit about the history of the Dominican Republic and the Haitian borderlands. Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of this region, its experience with colonialism, and how you came to work here?
Well, how I came to, I guess I developed a research project when I was in an undergraduate in Haiti, and that brought me to Haiti, and then later applied for a Fulbright with my friend to work on this massacre. The project was on Haitian migration to the Dominican Republic, and I discovered this this massacre by the dictator Rafael Trujillo in 1937 of like upwards of 15,000 ethnic border migrants, which got me. And so that was my first big research project. And I learned Haitian Creole, and I did I did interviews with the survivors of the massacre, as well as the Dominicans who participated. And that project, which involved, talking to Haitians who were given land in these tiny colonies on the Haitian side of the border, and I was struck by how they remembered when Trujillo came to visit them in these little tiny border communities, they remembered and would recite the songs that they had learned for official state visits, which made me think this is an insane level of hegemony, and I have to understand the Trujillo regime. So I've been going to the border for a long time, and for those of you who don't, so the Dominican Republic, it was where Columbus landed, and so the animals that he brought to as provision animals, became these feral herds, and this also was the first area which was really genocidal of the indigenous population, and it's interesting because today there's a little bit of a neo-Taino movement. The indigenous people were called Taino, and they've tested the blood of Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Dominicans have like no Taino blood, which is interesting. And I think it accounts for it reminds us that this was really a genocide. It was horrible. And so So when I discovered, I mean, I've been working on the Bacchae. I have a number of articles about this spirit demon, which is, not well known. There, the zombie has attracted a lot more attention, and become a part of American popular culture. Of course, it originally came from Haiti during the U.S. occupation of Haiti. But when I have done research on the Bacchae in urban contexts, the Bacchae appears as a little black man. Um, so, but in this little town in the Haitian Dominican frontier, Banica, which is, has an important history of animal history, shall we say, because it was the center of the cattle trade to Haiti and so forth. What struck me was why, and it took me a long time to figure this out. Like, why would the animals brought by Columbus be the only spirit demons that the Baka present as? And I think it has to do with the trauma of this genocidal, moment in on the island. And this is, of course, before Haiti and Dominican Republic were differentiated. It was all one island. It was one Spanish colony for the first 200 years. But, the dogs were used as slave catching tools. The horses, from on top of a horse, you could mow down thousands of indigenous peoples with a rifle. And the cattle caused famine by eating corn, which was the most important crop for the indigenous peoples throughout Latin America. And also the pigs, which became these giant feral boars. Pigs go wild in one generation when left on their own. And they, of course, would eat all the tuber crops because the Taino diet was based on corn, which was sacred and still is a ritual offering in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In fact, the indigenous people are gone, but the food system and is intact. So we have a lot of indigenous traces in popular culture in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. But getting back to but these Boers, they ate all the tuber crops, and Dominicans in particular, but Haitians as well, love these tubers. Like if you go to a Dominican market, or if you eat, there's a growing Dominican population in Los Angeles, and I did a book launch in El Bacano, which is a Dominican restaurant, and the tuber crops are very important in sancocho, which is the most important meal. You would have it on Sundays. It's a soup made from like 5 different roots, and some of them are tubers, but some of them are just roots, and they're just beloved, and that comes from the indigenous heritage. And so, these animals were associated with famine, violence, and really they enabled the dispossession of the indigenous population. So I came to and the Taino were killed off very early on Hispaniola, but the slaves came in very early to replace them. So there was quite a bit of commingling between Tainos and slaves, precisely because the genocidal you know practices created such a dramatic population decline. So that's also a feature of the Dominican Republic. There's some features of the Dominican Republic that are different from other Caribbean nations that I should mention, because the big story in the Caribbean is sugar and slavery. But the Dominican Republic, because the indigenous people were vanquished so early, they brought in slaves very early. So the Dominican Republic is strange because they have a freedmen population, really by 1700. It's a majority of freedmen, and which is why there's a lot of um, popular discourse around why Dominicans don't really see themselves as Black. And it has to do with Black means slavery in the Caribbean. And, the Dominican Republic early on was mostly free, although later on, during the U.S. military occupation in the early 20th century, the companies like United Fruit created sugar plantations, but they brought in Haitian and West Indian labor to cut the cane. So that also reinforced this idea that Dominicans are quite different from Haitians, because the Haitians came to be associated with cutting cane, which is slavery basically in the Caribbean. But the Dominican Republic is weird also because sugar they never had a sugar boom. Like the wealthy countries like Haiti in the 18th century became the jewel in the crown of the French Empire via sugar. Barbados and Jamaica had earlier sugar booms, and then Cuba in the 19th century had a sugar boom. But the Dominican Republic had a little sugar, but they never really defined the country. So that's part of why Dominican identity is quite different from the other Caribbean islands. And the other thing that's interesting about the DR is that when Haiti becomes the world's largest sugar producer in by the 1770s, the Dominican Republic provides they plant every last bit of land in sugar. And so the Dominican Republic, which early on had a extensive cattle ranching economy like you have in parts of Jamaica, Colombia, and Mexico. But the Dominican Republic had this illicit cattle economy, which provided oxen for the sugar mills, because the Jamaica train, which was the 18th century sugar mill, was run by oxen. So and this became a very important illicit economy. And Dominicans, so the Haitian Dominican frontier and the central portion of it is very interesting to me, because you had the economy of the island of the Dominican Republic peaks when when Haiti is so profitable, um, providing extensive cattle ranching. But what's also interesting in this, I did a lot of basically my book interviews the most of the folks in my interviews were members of the Alcantara clan, were a very important ranching family, and a lot of them, because the customs houses in the border provided most of the Dominican state's revenue for a long time. A lot of Dominicans relocated into Haiti in order to not pay customs duties. So I met a lot of guys who spoke Creole and who had grown up in Tomasik, Haiti, and that's also interesting. See, the thing about the Dominican Haitian relationship is complicated, because in after the Haitian Revolution, there were efforts on the part of the French, the Spanish, and the British to retake Haiti because it had been so profitable. And they did it through the sparsely populated eastern portion of the island, which is today the Dominican Republic. And as a result of that, Haiti took over the eastern portion of the island for a while. And, you know, and so there's this, so that's true that the Dominican Republic got its independence from Haiti as well as Spain, which is most kind of unusual in the Caribbean. But and now historians, there's a kind of Dominican elite narrative that Haiti was this imperious country that militarily aggressed the Dominican Republic and so forth. But if you look now, historians are going back to the 19th century and saying, "Excuse me, the Dominican Republic was a poor colonial backwater. Many people wanted to be part of Haiti because Haiti had been a commercial giant, had the largest standing army in Latin America after the revolution, and was very plugged into German coffee circuits. And moreover, the remaining slaves, wanted to be free, and they were freed by Haiti, because Haiti, after the revolution, they put into place something called the free soil doctrine, that anyone who steps on Haitian soil would be free. So Dominican slaves were freed. So actually, a lot of Dominicans were quite happy about the relationship to Haiti in the 19th century, to become one nation. But but this narrative of official enmity is really it starts during the Trujillo regime, after the Haitian slaughter of ethnic Haitians. They actually were Dominicans, but they were ethnic Haitians in 1937, and basically Trujillo rewrote the historiography of the island into this kind of narrative of anti-Haitianism, which has become dominant among elites and the state today. Like today, the Dominican Republic and has become, the current president Abinader is a Trump ally, and he gets a lot of money for drug control and also for building a wall from Homeland Security. Notwithstanding the fact that the Dominican Republic is the number one drug trafficking route in Latin America, not Venezuela nor Trinidad. Just saying. So I hope that kind of clarifies. The Dominican Republic is most unusual, and its relationship to Haiti is most unusual. But I hope I've given you a little bit of the history that I think helps understand. It helps us understand how the DR is quite different from its neighbors.
Yeah, I think you have to understand some of the complexity of this history in order to understand the many interwoven spiritual beliefs and the political systems and things like that. So this is great. I'd like to shift a little bit now with that background to now talk a little bit more about the beliefs and practices of the indigenous populations that feature in your book, especially before colonization. And, you could kind of talk about the Dominican Republic as well as Haiti, because there's obviously a lot of crossover. But I would love to get your thoughts on what those practices were before colonization and then how they changed after this colonization.
Well, um, I think one of the important arguments that I stress in the book is that is precisely contrary to the official narrative of state enmity on the island, and has to do with the fact that Haiti and the Dominican Republic were one Spanish colony for 200 years, and I think that helps us explain in important ways why these storytelling genre in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the stories are quite similar. Although Haitians are attributed to only having the sorcery power strong enough to create the baka, and the Dominicans tend to get haunted by them. So and I argue that that's really a process of racialization because the slave trade was pushed by this narrative that the Africans needed to become Christianized, and their beliefs were villainized as a result, which is part of the reason why Haiti is considered basically the center of powerful sorcery in Latin America. So narcotraficantes in Mexico seek out Haitian magic, as do Colombians. I've discovered my research assistant in this book, George Rene, he is currently in New York, and some of his work involves protecting Colombians. And so I hear a little bit about this. But it's throughout Latin America. For whatever reason, even in Trinidad, there's this idea that Haitians have the most potent magic. And I think this has to do with, the blacker the skin, the blacker the magic. And of course, Haiti is really associated with slavery because of the revolution. And so they because of the Haitian Revolution, they've uh, shall we say they've come to embody their slave past in a way that is because they fought and won all of the important armies of Europe, and so they kind of they brought their it's the most radical revolution in the age of revolutions, because it was the only one that brought down slavery. And of course, Haitians paid dearly for it. Toussaint Louverture, even though he was the leader of the slave revolt, the French captured him and he died in a French prison. There's that. There's also the fact that this is the only war in which the winner of the war had to pay an indemnity to the loser. So Haiti paid an indemnity, which would be millions of dollars today, to France into the 1940s. And this is the only case I'm aware of. There's a long, very good series of articles in the New York Times on this subject, where they researched how these transfers were made, and how much they would be in contemporary dollars. But it's quite shocking. And of course, Haiti also suffered because the United States wouldn't trade with Haiti. France wouldn't trade with Haiti. So they had no trading partners throughout the 19th century, which is part of why the peasants go back to they refuse to cut cane anymore, and the country kind of the economy becomes I mean it goes I don't want to reinforce the stereotype of Haiti as a failed nation, but I will say that um, the economy could not flourish when you have no trading partners,
How
which
do
is
you
sort of
succeed? Yeah.
it's sort of the story we're seeing in contemporary Cuba as well. Thank you very much. Um,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into some of these specific spiritual practices, but I think some of our listeners might not be familiar with some of the terms. I
Ah,
wasn't before I read your book. So could you tell us a little bit about what a baka is, and then maybe talk a little bit about a zombie, and we'll talk about some of the mythology about those in a moment, but just defining the terms for those who
oh,
might not be
absolutely.
familiar.
So, I started this project using using the framework by Michael Taussig, who has a book called The Devil and Commodity Fetishism. And this is a genre of devil pack tales that you have in Latin America where if somebody, and he explains it through this kind of peasant ideology that everybody's poor, but if somebody makes a lot of money, a spike in money, they must have some magic um, that explains how they could make more money. So they are devil pack tales, but they're also shape-shifting tales because this is a form of sorcery which turns people into animals. So you go in, like for example, Haitians tell a lot of stories about zombie meat. Zombie meat is when you go and you go to cook the meat, but it foams white. White is the color of death in Haiti. And so there's this thing about zombie meat. I've not heard about that in the Dominican Republic, but I did hear about stories. I mean, I have an enormous chapter in my book on these encounter narratives where men coming home at night will encounter these phantasmic beasts, which are not beasts. Um, and it appears dogs, cattle, especially horses. I've got a big analysis in one of my stories about a guy who encounters a horse, and these are actually people who've been turned into animals. And so they're not. And I asked them like, how did you know it was a baka and not like a horse? And that's also kind of interesting because these are male stories, but I often hear women being playing a role behind the scenes about identifying the baka. So, for example, I have one interview where a guy is coming home at night on his motorcycle. He comes across a feral pig as next to mahogany, which is interesting to me because these are two species which are today extinct. The Dominican Republic provided a lot of mahogany to the world until the arts and crafts movement, until the 1920s. And so there's no more, the fine logwoods are all gone today. So I was like, this is interesting because the feral pigs were killed off in the 1979 pig eradication scheme that USAID forced upon the Dominican Republic. So that was also kind of interesting, thinking about how, in a way, these stories also manifest a kind of an environmental, memory that because these phantasms are no longer here with us. So that's also kind of interesting. I think I've lost my train of thought here, though. Um, but anyway, so they're shapeshifters. They're also devil pack tales. Um, and, I got imploded into some of these stories too. Like, for example, George, my research assistant, um, I did a visit with him to Port-au-Prince when I went around, and I said, finally, after all these years, I actually need to talk to the secret society members because the secret society members can turn into anything. Of course, they're bragging. Hans Nelson, who you met in my first chapter, um, he bragged to me that he can turn into a wheelbarrow, but I've never heard of a manifestation into a wheelbarrow. I think that's just his braggadocio. But anyway, so George and I had a session, and I spent about, I think, a week interviewing with him, and I was like, finally, I have to meet the secret society members, and they're expensive. They're expensive. So George, I paid George and I paid Hans for that interview. But when I left, George was said to have a zombie in his leg because he made too much money. Uh, so, I also
Fascinating.
got involved in some of these popular narratives myself. And another one is the murder of Javier. So this is, I stayed for many years. I stayed at a woman named Doña Pico's house, and she's the head of the cofradia, which are these pilgrimage societies. So she's got a lot of beds, so it was super convenient for me to stay there. And she's got a nice bathroom that the Catholic Church provided. And so the guy down the street shoots himself in one night, and it was interesting. Okay, they never described it as a suicide, but now I've learned that in Catholicism, you can't get a proper burial if it's a suicide. So they never described it as a suicide, although we showed up and we saw the blood on the walls and everything. But we were talking about the event, and I said, I heard footsteps in the middle of the night. And she's like, well, that was the Baka. So then she's quoting me that I came to authorize the Baka sighting because I had heard footsteps in the middle of the night. And so
Oh,
that's also
wow.
kind of interesting how in some of these stories, I don't think I mentioned it in the book, but I became a part of the implotment of these narratives.
Wow, that's fascinating.
But these Baka beliefs are very, it's interesting because to me they're very signature Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Like if you grew up on the island, maybe not in the diaspora, but if you grew up on the island, everyone has a Baka story. I have a friend whose mom lives in New York, and she wakes up with bruises because her auntie is biting her at night all the
Oh,
time.
wow.
She wakes up. I've been trying to interview her. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to, but and so these are I feel like they're signature Haiti and Dominican Republic cultural icons, shall we say. But the zombie's the only one of the there are many spirit demons in Haiti. But the Baka is very less known. So I guess that was also part of my attraction to this phenomenon because if you go back, there was a moment in Haiti when there were a lot of famous anthropologists from the United States, and you'll find a fleeting reference in the reference in like the references of Melville Herskovitz or Maya Deren. But really there hadn't been a kind of a full-on story, and I thought that these stories were interesting enough to and I like the ways in which I think the story of this of the spirit demon also it causes us to rethink Haitian Dominican relations in a way that is not just the kind of ethno-nationalist um, Dominican, story, which has been around since the Trujillo regime.
Fascinating. So I'd love to get your thoughts on where you see ties between religion or spirituality and colonial practices like violence and slavery. So, for example, in your book, you talk a bit about the zombie, which you mentioned represents, quote, the animated corpse as allegory of the slave's disempowerment, end quote, and potentially also as souls of the enslaved seeking revenge on the living. You also mention that, again, quote, the Baka should be seen as part of a multi-species story of imperial violence and of spiritual power, likely deployed as weapons of the weak during slavery, end quote. So can you talk a little bit about how these beliefs represent these ideas and the experiences with slavery and colonialism?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the zombie gets picked up in American popular culture during the U.S. occupation through I Walked with a Zombie, the film, the classic film, which is completely set in Haiti, actually. Yeah, yeah.
I haven't seen
Um,
that.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I'm quoting George about the Baka as the restless spirits of the slaves who seek to are coming back for revenge. That it was George's story. Um, but they're also very much like in Haiti and the DR both. But I think this genre of storytelling starts with the Haitian Revolution. So there's a um, a sorcerer who was said to be one of the first guys to get the Haitian Revolution going, Macandal, and he bragged that he turned into a mosquito and escaped the authorities and started the Haitian Revolution. Um, also in my dog chapter, I mention Clément Barbeau, who is a Tonto Macoute, who escaped from jail during the Duvalier period by turning into a black dog. And Duvalier actually had a massacre of all black dogs after this because he was so pissed off. So,
Wow.
but this is, I mean, so I think this genre of the Baka is fugitivity, which is, I think a really important genre for slave resistance. But it's interesting because even though the Dominican Republic has a kind of ambivalent relationship to its slave past, there are plenty of stories of 19th century and 20th century figures who escaped authorities by turning into a Baka. And I've got a couple of them, and there's an Alcantara in my which I heard about this, who's like the uncle of my research assistant's father, who was the former mayor. That's also interesting to me, is that you know I think example during the Chupacabra episode in Puerto Rico, which I've studied a little bit, there was this idiom of Puerto Ricans in the United States kind of dissing the Puerto Ricans on the island for like how ludicrous could you be? But these stories about Baka, I have them from rural elites. I mean, the mayors, the alcaldes, the local teachers. I mean, I have plenty of stories from them, and I thought that was interesting too. Elites in Santo Domingo would not be familiar with this kind of stuff, but in a rural context, absolutely. And does that answer? I mean, I should also mention that shape-shifting beliefs are a part of Taino indigenous belief. And in order to really kind of understand, I mean, I don't think I use the term origin because I can't prove it, but Taino absolutely. If you look at the Amazonian legends collected by Claude Lévi-Strauss, it's the foundational legends of Amazonian peoples, and the Taino came from the Amazon. They're all about shapeshifting. I mean, it's like his books on myths are all about Amazonian shapeshifting. So that's a thing among the Amerindians. And also, West Africa has secret societies that are very similar to the Haitian secret societies, in which you have leopard men who are rumored to turn into leopards. That's the most regal of all the shapeshifting in West Africa. But there's these shapeshifting beliefs, interestingly, also take place in other kind of intimate animal economies. And for example, the Sami people of Russia or Lapland, right? I guess they're nomadic, so they traverse the boundary between Russia and its neighbors. But I read a lot about the Sami people, and the story of Santa Claus is not about him being drawn by reindeer. He's turning into a reindeer because the Sami people have similar shape-shifting beliefs about their reindeer. And that's also the case in other places where you have where animals are at the center of their mythic life. Their economy as well as their mythic life.
Wow, that's so interesting. So I want to shift gears here a little bit because we've mostly been talking about history, and I want to shift a little bit to the present because I think that a lot of our listeners might not be as familiar with this part of the world, or maybe don't realize that things like witchcraft, voodoo, and other forms of magical spirituality are still very much practiced in the modern world. And you've alluded to this with a few examples already. But I would love to get your thoughts on where you see legacies of colonialism and trauma in these practices in the DR and in Haiti today, and or where you see changes that have been brought about by more recent events or history in this region.
Well, let's see. So one thing that I started in this project, in working through this material, I became interested I began to see the Taino legacy in a way that, as a Caribbeanist working the Hispaniola, you assume that the indigenous legacy is gone. But that's not the case. In certain areas, the foodways are completely Taino in the Dominican Republic, which is very interesting till today. And a lot of the names of the tubers, these beloved tubers and so forth, are also from this Taino legacy. So the foodways are there. But then I started thinking about the semi, because in Dominican altars, you have the top part, which has the chromolithographs, the Catholic chromolithographs, and then you have a mantel, like a cloth. But if you go under the altar, you have Taino spiritual legacies. So you have the Taino had a practice where a semi was a stone that a spirit could be put into it. It was like similar to this belief that a baka is an animal which has had a spirit placed into it. The idea of a semi for the Taino was that you could invest a spirit into it. And this is also today, Haitians have these spiritual bottles, which a zombie would be the spirit from a dead person that's trapped in the bottle, and it empowers a spell. So the semis are present if you don't see them unless you know to look in because they're private. And that's kind of interesting too, that this is the kind of the secret part of the altar, but that's where the power lies. You also see stones in Cuban sorcery practices as well, in Palo Monte as well. But they're semi stones which are kept in water, and they need water to be alive. So they're kind of like living spirits that have a close association with the water. And of course, a lot of the deities in Haitian Dominican Valdon have associations with water. So that's a big thing. You have La Sirène, this the mermaid. She appears in a lot of Haitian art because she's also a manifestation of one of the Haitian goddesses. So the water thing, I mean, I don't have anyone I can interview to ask why it's like it's kind of the private part of the altar. So I wanted to be respectful. So, and I think you'd probably get 101 different answers for why the stones are in water. But to me, it suggests that they're not inert, that they have a kind of personhood.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's also, I think one way of thinking about these spirits is that there's a kind of personhood. You can think about it in a kind of an ecological way, that there's a kind of personhood attributed to animals in cultures where the animal has been very prominent, like in extensive cattle ranching economies. I mean, also Dominican backwoods hunters, they hunted with their dogs. Um, in retrospect, I wasn't sure about this, and in retrospect, I should have put a kind of conclusion around the figure of the dog because that is a difference that would have been interesting. I wasn't sure it was the case until I talked to some other people after the book was done, but the Dominican Republic has a very important culture of popular hunting, which is why a lot of escaped slaves like to come to Hispaniola because they could go up the mountains and there were all these ample, feral boars and they could stay outside of slavery. The Dominicans had the privilege, really, in the 19th century to survive without being a slave. And there's a scholar, Ann Eller, who's demonstrated how people from Puerto Rico and Cuba, where slavery raged into the 1880s, they came over as maritime maroons and
Mm.
took, because they were, in the 19th century, once Haiti had freed the slaves, they were free on just by standing on the soil of Hispaniola. And so so the dog in Haiti and the Dominican Republic is slightly differentiated. And in Haiti, the dog is really vilified. Like Haitians hate dogs, and I think that conforms to their fear. They're afraid of dogs. They don't keep dogs. If they keep them as their attack animals, and I think that conforms to the way in which Haiti sees its heritage as more slave. Whereas Dominicans have this public culture of dogs. If you ever go on tourism to the Dominican Republic and you get out of the all-inclusives and you go to a rural town, or even in Santo Domingo, there are public dogs which are very well cared for. And I think that corresponds to and people feed them. They're really nice to them. And I think that corresponds to the important role of hunting in Dominican popular culture. So that should have been my conclusion, but I wasn't positive that difference was so stark, but now I think it is.
Interesting. This is always what happens right afterwards.
Yeah.
Of course, you find the one thing that would have made the difference. So I'd love to hear a little bit more. You've talked about how some of these practices have changed over time, some of these beliefs in Baka and zombies. Um, I would, I'm curious if you think that to Dominicans and Haitians, these beliefs still symbolize colonialism and the slave trade, or do you think they've taken on new meanings related to exploitation, capitalism, something more recent? How do you think that works?
Well, I think that they've taken on new meanings in the contemporary world, and so for example, I've been very intrigued by the use of drug traffickers who need serious protection, and they will seek out Haitian sorcery. Not necessarily, it could be a baka, it could be a zombie. Um, so there are ways in which there are new. I mean, this is kind of a culturalist argument that a Dominican wouldn't necessarily see these as colonial remnants. I mean, I'm making that argument through tracing over time these little tiny footprints about animal histories and sorcery elements. For example, because during the Haitian Revolution, there were so many Europeans who came to check on their plantations. We have a very, very rich collection of travel accounts for that period. And I found, for example, a wanga, which is a Haitian protective device. Again, you could insert a spirit into it in the form of a dog. And I found these little traces in my in my corpus of travel accounts that I always go back to, and which indicate that you know, that these devices are still being used in everyday life, but I think they've accrued new meanings. But the drug traffic thing, I mean, that's also interesting because it's also the devil pack narrative of, you know, but there's a way in which, illicit economies, you need protection. You need protection against the police. Um, and what better way than with a wanga or a baka or a zombie, bottled to protect you. Because that's serious protection. So they're definitely being recycled in new ways. Um, and as I say, I mean, I'm putting the pieces together in a way that I don't think my informants in Banica, the Alcantara clan and their field hands would recognize the indigenous legacy because they don't know that history. I mean, Dominican Republic has the average education level is like fifth grade. Yeah,
Oh,
especially in
interesting.
rural areas. Um, so I don't think, my informants would not. I mean, it's interesting. My book is coming out in Spanish
Mm,
soon. I've got the Spanish translation, and I'll be very curious to see the response by Dominicans. I mean, the book itself, the cover picture is a Haitian carnival figure, and that was alarming to my Dominican friends that there's a
ah,
Haitian carnival figure. I thought it's an amazing image, and it fits because the baka, of course, is seen as something Haitian.
hmm.
Dominicans don't have the power to generate a baka, so I thought it fit. But for the Dominican version, I from that reaction, I was like, I have to have a Dominican cover, and I've got it, and I'm pleased.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that's a very important update. And then we had some issues around the title because Bette Noir, the translator, she's a medical translator, and she came up with basically Black Beasts was the title.
Oh,
Literal translation of Bête Noire, which in French means something uncanny,
yeah.
something like an enemy that you can't get rid of. So it's got this complicated series of associations in French, and Black Beast was unacceptable. So I had to. I mean, it's like racist, terrible. So anyway, that I had to do a lot of polling of my colleagues to get a good title, but I got one now, so pleased about that.
Fascinating. Yeah,
But
the
I really thought,
implications.
oh Jesus, she's missing something.
Yeah.
To think that I could possibly call the book that. I mean, it is a literal translation, but it just loses all the French. If you look it up, it's one of these untranslatable terms that just
Yeah.
has a lot of uncanny kind of associations with it. And so that was like, please, no,
This is a problem with so much translation, right? You're never going to get all the nuance, and then you're talking about some complex spiritual concept, and that's
forget it.
even more the case. Yeah. Well, I think so. Actually, along with that, I think one of the most interesting things about your work is that it's very anthropological in the sense that you do combine historical research with then ethnographic interviews with living people, and you look at that long stretch. So I wonder if you could just very briefly talk about how combining this past and present in these ways shaped your understanding of the people in this region, both past and present.
Well, I've always done oral histories, partly because when I started working the Dominican Republic, there was so little written on the Dominican Republic that I kind of had to. I used oral history to kind of identify to me things that were important to people, and and along those lines, once I saw that they were important, then I would go back to the archives. So that's kind of long how I'd worked. But I mean, in a case, when you're doing this kind of material. I mean, my children were growing up, so I couldn't go for long periods of time, but I made a lot of frequent trips. And I got, but I also, I will say this to be completely frank, is that I've always used a research assistant, partly because these are stories that are male stories. They're drinking tales, and it's inappropriate for me to go and collect these stories without a dude. So I have a research assistant in Haiti and a research assistant in the DR. And frankly, Abel, my research assistant in the DR, he had, he today he manages the family farm, which used to be cattle, and now it's just variety of different products. And but he basically had heard all of these stories, so it made my week-long visits to the island very efficient because he'd heard all these stories and he would cue them. He'd basically say, "Oh, tell me the story about this." So I mean, it was just a great way to work because I didn't have to go. It would have taken me 10 more years to finish this book if I hadn't been able to work that way. But, I mean, these are his uncles, his field hands, people that he's heard these stories. He has drinks a beer, with his friends and he hears the story. So he'd heard them all. And they're also great storytellers. And the oratorical element I think Dominican oratory is just, they have the art of the story, and I just have a huge admiration for Dominican oratorical skills, and that I think is something that drove me in this project because I mean I don't know if you got to the final chapter about La Puerquita con las nalguitas doraditas. It's a story about the guy who has sex with a Christmas pig. Like that is it's so funny. And if you listen to the recording, like they're just guffawing. Like and I say, like, I don't know if they're just, this is a country which was militarily had two bouts of US military intervention, and maybe they were like tripping me up. Like, here's the American, we're gonna make her really embarrassed. Like I think that may well have been part of it, but it's also it's just a fabulous like story that I had really a lot of fun collecting and then also making sense of it.
That's great. Yeah, that one's definitely an amusing tale. So, to wind us down here from our discussion, I want to get your final thoughts on how studying religion and history together can inform us about, for example, colonial policies, authoritarianism, past and present, because I think studies of spiritualism and religion are often left out or even considered irrelevant in discussions of history and policy. So, how do you think your approach really highlights some of these systems of oppression, these ruling policies, these governments differently than other historical approaches, for example?
Well, I think once you get into the realm of these, you know, mythic beliefs, shall we say, I tend to avoid the term religion because people who believe in Bacchac can be evangelicals, they can be Catholics, they can be voodooisants, they all share these stories. So I tend to avoid the term religion as such, but in the broader field of comparative religious studies, yes, this is the world of voodoo. But I think that it helps you get at, I mean, as a person who I've studied political violence, I studied dictatorship, um, and one of my informants remembers that there were a lot of these spirit demons around during the Balaguer regime, Balaguer was in power for 12 years after my dictator, Rafael Trujillo. And so I'm actually writing about Balaguer now and it's kind of interesting because it was a period of horrendous state violence that was very camouflaged because he was trying to get USAID and World Bank money. So it was a faux democracy. So the repression, which was overt under Trujillo, goes underground during Balaguer, and I think that helps explain why the place was surging with spirit demons, which were hidden. So I have all these stories about spirit demons which go underground, which seems to correspond to the repression of Balaguer compared to Trujillo. I don't know if that's an argument, but that's a correlation or a correlation, shall we say, that I found kind of interesting. But I've been spending some time with the 1970s. He was in power from the 70s sporadically to the 90s, and I think that when my informant said, "Oh my God, you have no idea how many spirit demons were around," and back then, and I think the then would be the 90s, and so that made me think about the Balaguer period and the way in which this kind of the repression, which is covert, seems to correspond with the invisibility of the spirit demons. There's even a story that Duvalier and Guzman, who was one of the Dominican presidents, they had a border treaty where the Dominican president asked for all the zombies, which the zombie spirits, which were being harbored in Haiti, he wanted them back.
Oh, interesting.
I know. I know. I mean,
Huh.
the one thing I will say that is has been a challenge for me in studying this material for the Dominican Republic and Haiti is that there's much more literature on Haitian spirituality. Again, because because they were more exotic and blacker, and there was more exotic interest in the 1940s and henceforth. But I don't have nearly as much for the Dominican Republic, which makes it hard. Sometimes I want to correlate this timing of a particular story, and I can't, because we have the timeless present in the few folklorists we have for the DR. But there's a couple of folklorists, contemporary folklorists, who have been helping me. But you have just so much more for Haiti, and I think it corresponds to the ways in which the Dominican Republic, they don't see themselves they're not seen as Black enough, and so you don't have this corpus of folklore that you have for Haiti, which is also kind of unfortunate.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Robin, for joining us today. This has been such a great discussion. I really appreciate all your insights.
Well, thank you so much for the careful read. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much to our listeners for joining us today. I would encourage you to find Professor Derby's most recent book, Bête Noire, Sorcery as History in the Haitian-Dominican Borderlands, at your favorite independent bookstore if you want to continue learning about this fascinating topic. You can also find the ebook for free on the Duke University Press website, which I'm told has better images. So I encourage you to seek that out as well. If you did enjoy this podcast, please make sure to like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We also very much appreciate your ratings. You can find full episodes and curated playlists on our YouTube channel at Luskin Center for History Policy. And don't forget to check us out on TikTok at UCLA History Policy for short video summaries of every new podcast episode.
Thank you for listening to the History Politics podcast, Putting the Past to Work, from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.